The Emerald Cup is a celebration of the plant, and I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the major confounder that we're dealing with not only here on the West Coast. I'm from Miami, and so I had to think of a way to share with you some of the frustrations I have as an educator. I'm at the University of Miami, and what we deal with there with respect to the constraints that Prohibition imposes, not only on research, which is where you probably hear it. Remember, Sanjay Gupta sort of made this subject come to light when he talked about Sue Sisley's research and yet things that kept it from happening. It happens on different levels, and it also includes the education that mainstream physicians don't get because of its federal prohibition now. So we collectively call this a talk on how science and reasoning matter. And that's going to be the prevailing theme of today's talk. It is a keynote. And so I'm hoping you'll come back from wherever you came from, bring back home some insight into things and perspectives you may not have thought about before. Now, I'm here from Florida as a farmer. I'm a physician, I'm a board certified anesthesiologist, but long before I went into medicine, I already knew about plants. That was my greenhouse there. And so I wanted to share with you that I feature tropical ornamentals, colorful things, and that people think of cannabis as being fairly monochromatic, green, terpenes in the trichome showing some gray, but there is color. And whether it's black gorilla or golden berry, these are different things. So the plant also has some ornamental value. I want to start off with this little slide because it was a quote, and it actually does speak about science and reasoning mattering, because it says, without some common baseline of facts, without a willingness to admit new information and concede that your opponent is making a fair point and that science and reason matter, we'll keep talking past each other, making common ground and compromise impossible. So these are the realities in an era where fake news is coming up, and so I wanted to share that with you this way. And so it's going to be important that with this group in particular, I lecture to medical students, physicians, healthcare providers. I want to try to put this in a way that you can take home core messages, because it's really not that complicated. And so we'll spend a little time talking about not just the plant, but the receptor system in all of us that the plant identified. We don't have that because there's a plant out there. We have it because, in fact, that's the way we're hardwired. The plant appeared long after, not just humans or mammals, but all vertebrates, going back to the order of almost 500 million years before the plant ever appeared. This is the way our bodies adjust to the stresses of nature. The way it first came to my attention was actually when I went off to Emory University and studied chemistry. I looked at what chlorophyll looks like. Chlorophyll is a really neat molecule. It's what enables all plants to take light and make it to your food or their food. And why is that a neat trick? Because a plant is existentially rooted. It can't forage around for its food, so it develops this technique of how to get its energy and its food source from sunlight. The molecule on the left there, which is the green, it says magnesium in the middle, is identical to that other round circular molecule on the right, which is hemoglobin. That's your lifeblood. And in essence, then, chlorophyll is a plant's lifeblood, with the exception of having iron and hemoglobin, which is why a doc would give, say, a lady who's with child, lots of extra iron to make sure that the hemoglobin, which is there to carry oxygen, needed for life, is a full complement, the same way a farmer actually gives magnesium to a plant to keep its chlorophyll fully engaged. That's an important molecule because when you apply the basic chemistry to all plants, it makes more sense why plants' molecules would, in many respects, act as medicines that help us feel a certain way. We're more connected biochemically than I think most people realize, and I do think it's helped make me a better doc by understanding the power of plants' chemicals. You can go back over 100 years ago when on the left you see the opium poppy and on the right, willow tree. The bark of it is used to make aspirin. And yet, over 100 years ago, pharmaceutical companies were using those plant chemicals to try to help people, but also exploit, and they all look for certain market share. So this, in fact, shows that heroin, used to be a pharmaceutical agent. It was synthesized in about 1874. Bayer worked with it and had it available, and it originally actually was marketed over the counter, even to children. Long after that, they found out that, in fact, it was more addicting than the morphine that initially was sold to be less addicting form of. And so with that reality, it was eventually pulled from the market, but the market timing of when Bayer was producing aspirin as their new, safe, natural pain reliever was not coincidental necessarily, nor was the fact that when Bayer lost its patent to aspirin in the early 1930s, would have been when the Marijuana Tax Act is looking at, in a competitive sense, why would we need cannabis as a pain medicine now that we had this miracle drug aspirin that back then was only known for its analgesic or pain relieving effects, not so much for all the things we know about it today. So in fact then, a plant's chemical powers are huge. I have great respect for those chemical powers, and maybe Michael Pollan said it best when he says, they nourish us and poison us, they delight our senses of sight, smell, and taste, they calm our nerves or wake us up, and they even change the content of our minds and the experience of our consciousness. That's a powerful phrase. And so, I had somebody, and Mike Pollan answered it this way too, who asked from the audience once, they say, hey doc, you're a scientist. In science terms, what does it mean to be stoned? And you know what? It's a great question. And if you've ever heard anybody respond to it and they gave you a definitive answer, don't believe it, because we don't understand the scientific basis for consciousness. How could you learn the scientific basis for a change of consciousness? So we say we'll leave that to the poets for now. To go back 10,000 years, though, lets you see how human beings have interacted with cannabis, because at the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago, there were only a few areas in the world which stayed warm and wet enough for certain animal and plant species to have survived. And one of those was off the eastern slopes of the Himalayas, at high elevations. That's where it was. And that's where some of the earliest archaeological evidence showing human beings linked with cannabis derives from. Jump forward several thousands of years, here's from 700 BC in China, a tomb of a Chinese, well, before China was China, shaman. And in there were 2 bowls found, not just with cannabis in those bowls, but female flowers from cannabis, which we know are the most potent portions of where the chemicals are expressed. This is nothing new. It's been used by human beings for millennia and found its way around the world with human agriculture. Plants have miraculous ways of finding a way to go from point A to point B, which they have to do, or they'll succumb to the natural stresses of when nature throws them a curveball, a freeze, a big windstorm, maybe something of a pathogen or something that wipes it out. So plants are ingenious. Ferns have little things called spores. They use the wind as a vector to get from here to there, and a plant starts growing someplace else. Some trees and stuff that you know from fruit trees have seeds in the fruit. An animal eats the fruit, walks somewhere else, defecates out the seed, the plant props up there. How smart is that of the plant to figure out a way to move from one place to another to spread itself around? Well, cannabis has managed to find its way around the globe with human agriculture, which represents 10,000 years of movement. And I'd rather place 10,000 years of at least the suggestion that it works favorably with our genes than perhaps the way we've changed it in the last 30 years, particularly to exploit the THC content, which is now huge, and other particular terpenes, one called myrcene in particular, which is the hypnotic stoner one that people sometimes seek. So this is really the evolution of the plant and used for humans. And if you see all the way over there to the left, this shows hemp being cultivated in America, but back at the end of the 19th century. So along with the advent of cotton, hemp is a textile, while the similar cousin of the plant to different varietals of cannabis can be the drug spiritual use one that we see today. But they're somewhat different. Now, how do doctors regard cannabis, and how do they look at things? Well, the American Medical Association actually has a disposition and an ethical statement in terms of how physicians and communities are there in its mission statement. But you can go back from 2017 to 1937, 80 years ago, is when we had something called the Marijuana Tax Act. And at that time, the intelligent doctors who were trying to look at, should we take it out of formulary? Because all pharmaceutical companies had cannabinoid medicine, cannabis in particular, in all their formularies. It had been used that way for centuries, and it was marketed by those pharmaceutical companies. So in fact, even back then, they knew that it had an unknown quantity but might have important uses in medicine, psychology. We've sort of confirmed a lot of that today. So if you look at where things really changed, it changed in the mid-1990s. The father of endocannabinoid science, or cannabinoid medicine, is widely regarded to be an Israeli researcher, Raphael Mechoulam. He's 87 years old now, but in the early 1960s, he's the first to have identified the chemical structure of THC, the only intoxicating substance that derives from cannabis. But the key discovery was in the early to mid-1990s when he identified the body's own chemicals that you all have in you that THC mimics, called anandamide 2-AG. That was a watershed moment because at that point, because now we knew the mechanism of action for how cannabis and cannabinoids work, it no longer became an issue of social injustice, it became an issue of healthcare. And so you go back to around the mid-1990s, that's exactly when California, right here, started to promote and bring to light the fact that this is a medicine. It's something that has known uses, and it's something that, for in that day, was called compassionate access, should be part of modern day's cannabis formulary. So if you look at the receptor systems, it's not that new. We have other receptor systems. Anybody heard of endorphins? Endocannabinoids, endorphins. These are two different receptor systems, both critical, both very instrumental in pain management. My fellowship in pain management is there, and I'm a board-certified anesthesiologist. But I'll tell you that manipulating the endorphin system was only possible after the mid-1970s when the opium poppy flower, again, identified one of our receptor systems that's in us, not unlike how the cannabis plant identified this other receptor system we call endocannabinoid receptors. So, in fact, then, the focus of attention from medicine and real docs is really not on the plant itself, it's on the receptor system that the plant works through. That's an important concept and difference, because I'm going to share with you in just a moment an understanding of insight into why we're wired that way and what it does. And it's going to kind of be hard to think of this without thinking about the plant. But imagine if you were a focused researcher and you couldn't help but focus not on the target, but at the tip of that arrow, I've put a cannabis leaf. Anybody shoot guns or archery? The moment you lose pure focus on the target, by thinking about what's on that arrow, you shoot misses. The key is focusing purely on the endocannabinoid system that we have. And the importance of that system was so pronounced that NIH researchers in 2013, endocannabinoid researchers in the NIH came out with this statement. And these are not just run-of-the-mill researchers. These are MD, PhD researchers whose opinion is highly valued. George Packer and Kunos, up here, Pal Packer and George Kunos, said that modulating the endocannabinoid system activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. Wow. That is a powerful statement. Almost all diseases affecting humans. Unless you know how it works, it's kind of hard for most physicians and patients to think, how could one thing affect so many different organ systems? How's something related to epilepsy going to help fibromyalgia, where it's a whole different organ system? This is the receptor system that's the master control to fine-tune all other receptor systems. So here's what it is. We have a botanical medicine and or a plant substance. And they're regarded differently by government in that cannabis, and this is a classic rendering going back to the 1800s, can be thought of also by those differences between what a botanical medicine versus a plant substance would be. And those sort of have definitions coming from different arms of the government. It's scheduled by the DEA as a prohibited substance, something called Schedule 1. I'll show you the definition of that in just a second. And yet the Food and Drug Administration is there to evaluate not only research on things like this, but to determine sort of use versus abuse and package or otherwise warn physicians and patients accordingly. So what is the definition then for what the government ascribes to determining that cannabis today is prohibited? Well, it comes from something in 1970. It's called the Controlled Substance Act, and all medicines now are categorized in one of 5 categories, Schedule I being prohibited, and the definitions of 1, 2, and 3 there are those things that the government has said will determine the categorizing of this as a prohibited substance. And they say that, number 1, it has a high potential for abuse. 2 is that it has no currently accepted medical use in the United States. And 3, that there's a lack of an accepted safety profile for use of it under medical supervision. Well, the last part's kind of hard to do when it's prohibited, in that most states still don't have really close following of what happens under medical prohibition for supervising a patient's outcome. And that's key in this, because we haven't yet started to focus really on the most important determinant that cannabis has, like other medicines should. Do patients really do better? Outcome is critically important. When we say it has a high potential for abuse, well, what if I told you that Schedule II, legal drugs that physicians access and use in certain situations, include cocaine and morphine, okay, and barbiturates. These are all things that also have different potentials for abuse in many respects, as much or more than most people regard cannabis as having. So the key is the no accepted medical use in the United States. Well, I'm going to show you in just a second here about this study. It came out a year ago, January actually, and it's from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and it looked at an exhaustive look of all the world's research going back to find, is there really what we call evidence-based data to suggest what it works for compared to what's common folklore, anecdotal reports, suspicions, how do people use it? Evidence-based data reaches a different threshold, and this study did find that it does have clinical use. Now, I'm going to provide for you, if anybody wants to take one home, this particular statement here in terms of what knowledge it really works for as we enter 2018. And it does show that THC has its best evidence for efficacy, or does it work, for chemotherapy, nausea and vomiting, for chronic pain, and for the muscle spasms associated with multiple sclerosis. Those are the big 3 right now, and those have the benefit of having evidence-based data. So right away, at least one of those criteria that I showed you a moment ago for what the government defines it as should reflect that. Nevertheless, at this point, at this moment, everything else is what we call anecdotal suspicion. Doesn't mean it wouldn't make a great hypothesis to do real evidence-based data research on, but at this point, at this time, that's the reality of what fits in terms of those confines of evidence-based data. And these are the different formularies you can get of cannabis. The first 2 on top being the plant itself. The next group, and if you look at the column on the right, these are ranked from prohibited to Schedule I, to Schedule II and 3, to the bottom ones which are currently having research done on them. These are all different formularies, and there'll be the cards that I've printed from this that you're welcome to take home as a keepsake if you like from both those 2 sides. So let's talk about more botanical medicines, because it'll give you insight into a family of chemicals called alkaloids. And most medicines we think of are alkaloids that exert their effects on humans. And 2 of them, of course, would be the opium poppy and cocaine. These are controlled substances, not cannabis, but controlled substances. Legal doctors can prescribe it, legally prescribe it, and then because of that, doctors have to learn about it. The interesting thing about cannabis is because it's illegal, doctors don't get asked about it on what are called their national board exams. When you see a doctor and they're licensed in the state you're living in, that doctor actually has a license that comes from first having an MD, getting from medical school, but then in a way to look critically at one medical school's curricula versus another, all students, when they finish, have to take 3 parts of an examination called the National Board Exams. And guess what's not asked about because it's illegal? Cannabis. So doctors right now do not know what they need to know about this because it's not part of their routine curricula. Why? Because you have entities such as U.S. News and World Report which determine the rankings of medical school and is very competitive. And the students that come out of these programs, medical students, are inundated with lots and lots that they have to learn. So that's one of the confounders affecting education. These plant alkaloids were first discovered as being therapeutic for people in the late 1940s when Sir Robert Robinson received the Nobel Prize for just this work. He synthesized the original, what they call precursors or chemicals that lead to cocaine, also worked and found what morphine looks like as far as a chemical structure. So in his citation speech to receive the Nobel Prize, he mentions that plant alkaloids have been around and exploited, used therapeutically by human beings for thousands and thousands of years. And in areas where its use has been documented to go way back, the reports of its use by human beings often are prehistoric for how long people have used plant medicines. So whether morphine or cocaine, these are not new things. Plant alkaloids also include tobacco, and cannabis is inextricably connected to tobacco. The difference between a blunt, spliff, joint. Cannabis was first found to be smoked in Europe not that long ago. Smoking is a relatively recent invention. Columbus's second voyage comes to the New World in Cuba, sees the Taino Indians smoking tobacco. And they bring that habit back to Europe. It was done in pipe form. And lo and behold, sooner or later, somebody put some cannabis leaves in with their tobacco and said, "Whoa, that's different." All right, so the other things that I've pushed up here on the slides, the lower outside left and right, that's chocolate, that's coffee. You think those are habit forming? So what I want to do for a few moments is I want to try to give you a special insight. And I'm going to tell you right now that if you focus on the next few slides, you'll have an understanding that most of the doctors you see have yet to understand about why we have this system. So try to think for the next few minutes about what I'm saying, but not in context with thinking about the plant, all right? The most frequently cited researcher in the world, Vincenzo Di Marzo from Italy, was quoted back in 1998 saying that relax, eating, sleeping, forgetting, and protecting, those 5 things, might be some of the messages that are produced by the actions of endocannabinoids alone or in combination with other what he called mediators. Maybe now we appreciate terpenes more to fill up what other mediators could be. So I want you to think of those 5 things again, because there's a way to present this, and I do this for medical students, that give them a profound understanding of how endocannabinoids work from conception right through death. They are the things that keep you alive and well and compensating for those natural stresses that you get as life advances. So what we can do is talk about what it does. And really what these do for health is it sustains an organism. You're an organism, I'm an organism, by subtly adjusting its physiology. So in fact, when that happens, when you get a disease, your body doesn't suddenly succumb to it. It adjusts a little bit to keep a delicate balance. And that delicate balance is why I have this pentagon pictured on top of a narrow triangle. You know what happens to organisms or species when they get out of balance with nature? They become extinct. It's a critical part of how we stay in the game. So there are 2 kinds of receptors. Maybe you might have heard of this, called CB1 as compared to CB2 receptors. And CB1 receptors are generally thought to be in the brain and the nervous system, while CB2 receptors, I'll show in a minute, are in the gut, where the immune system is. CB1 receptors, I'd like you to think about eating and sleeping, and then as well about relaxing and forgetting. Eating and sleeping are on top, closer where the conception is, because when we are successful creatures, we have to be able to reproduce, and we have to find a way to grow. Most humans grow in the first 20 years of life. You're duplicating, making more cells, and then from about 20 years old to hopefully not oldest age, but older age, that's where you try to stay in the game. Eating and sleeping is essential for growth, and if nothing to do with the plant, we can talk also about CB2 receptors involving protecting. Protecting is different. Protecting is when you get older and you get a disease, generally you wind up dying from one disease, but dying with many others. And that's just part of the aging process. That's how we eventually succumb to those diseases. The things that keeps those other diseases in check are ways that your body subtly adjusts itself, the physiology, in order to stay in the game. So what's going on with eating and sleeping? Don't think about the plant now. Imagine if you didn't have a way to control eating and sleeping. It's essential for survival. It's essential for reproduction. And when you think of this, eating, everybody tends to think, oh, the plant munchies, that must be good for you. It's the way you're hardwired. The plant is mimicking what your body's naturally doing, and this is why it's doing it. It's essential for reproduction. But what about the relaxing and the forgetting that were the next two? Relaxing is real important. It's the way after the stresses at the end of the day affect you. So what do you have to do? You have to chill. Now, this guy might look like he's chilling on cannabinoids, but they're his own cannabinoids, the natural ones, not necessarily on the plant's cannabinoids, which are what's called exogenous. This is endogenous, endocannabinoids from within you naturally. What about what we said about forgetting? This was one of the other key components that the signals that the endocannabinoid system actually does. You know, when you talk to medical students about forgetting, they think, oh my God, I have to remember, I've got this test coming up, and so on. But in fact, forgetting is really important. Now follow this logic a moment. Imagine if you couldn't forget. Do you know what would happen if a woman after childbirth couldn't forget about the pain of childbirth? We'd probably be all only, no need in our language for the word brother or sister, because we'd all be only children. That's probably a synopsis of it. Only children. So what about then if you had a tribe, a primitive tribe? Let's pretend everybody in this room is part of a primitive nomadic tribe 5,000, 8,000 years ago. There's no cannabis out there. We're all eking out an existence, trying to find a fish to eat or something to keep us going. And out of nowhere comes some wild beast and it starts chasing us. And the sheer terror of that moment has our hearts pounding, our muscles are running to maybe climb up a tree where we're safe from that animal. And nightfall comes, the animal goes away or something might eat it. And imagine if you couldn't get the sheer terror of that moment out of your head by forgetting. It's therapeutic. It probably goes to the core of PTSD if you think about it that way. So we're hardwired so that by forgetting and recovering that night, you better be able to forget and recover, because at the stroke of dawn, you better be out of that tree or that animal might be back to eat you. So that's a little example on how being hardwired to forget, nothing to do with the plant, is actually helpful. Now, you can go in terms of not only painful or traumatic experiences, but what about pleasure? Pleasure, strangely enough, needs to have certain ways we forget about it also. Because imagine if human beings could not forget the extremes of pleasure. The same way that it's not healthy to constantly avoid anything that's painful, it's actually not that healthy to constantly seek that which is pleasurable. It may be at the source for dependency or addiction. And how about if we go back to that same example of prehistoric tribes? Let's pretend we're out there again foraging around, and in our group, there's two of our group, and we're going to call them, for the lack of better descriptions, Caveman Og and Lady Pleistocene. It's a long time ago. And of everybody in the group, those are the two that can't keep their hands off each other. They're always going at it, because how did human beings derive pleasure thousands of years ago? Sex. So let me ask you, if they're constantly going at it more than anybody else, and other members of the tribe are saying, hey, come on, or find a cave somewhere. If you were a saber-toothed tiger and you're trying to find who might be the two easiest ones to pick off, who would you likely choose? So even constant seeking of pleasure may not be really that healthy. And in fact, we probably all, everybody in this room, has had different experiences of pain and pleasure, and yet we selectively forget those things that let us still thrive by changing what we remember, and it determines more than anything else, really, our personalities, doesn't it? So, in essence, it's really cool, but the endocannabinoid system may be at the source of a biochemical explanation on how our personalities are different. That's yet to be discovered or really thought through, but I'm convinced it lies right there. So, what about that protect part? When you get older, your body starts to break down, and the endocannabinoids show up exactly in those organ systems which are failing to compensate. And anybody familiar with integrative medicine? You heard of that? It's not so much just holistic. Integrative medicine takes the best components of Western modern medicine and it combines it in an integrated way with Eastern cultures' medicines. So Eastern cultures involved with naturopathy, perhaps understanding plants and their effects on things, and even acupuncture can be ways that ancients in other cultures, especially Eastern cultures, where cannabis and people evolved thousands of years ago, may have had a certain understanding, because I want to show you this slide here a moment. I think it's a powerful potential smoking gun to depict where and why what are called CB2 receptors. Remember I said they're in the gut and the abdomen? That's where the immune system is. That we now know is key to survival, because a healthy immune system is really what determines how you respond to those natural stressors. So qi, which is the concept of flow in Oriental and traditional Chinese medicine, knows that the flow of life and energy and health is not through the brain, it's not through the heart and the lungs, it's through the abdomen and the gut. And there are more points on this acupuncture chart all around the abdomen. And yet, in modern times, we now know that, in fact, the Eastern medicine's traditional past meets Western medicine's new science future, because the picture on the right, if you look at the areas that are lit up, not only in red, but in fact in yellow and green there, most of it's concentrated around the gut. And the reason that this is important, you see the M in immunity, the first M, right above that, that's where the arm is. That's an intravenous site where they've injected in what's called a radioisotope labeled cannabinoid that finds its way to CB2 receptors. And 2 hours later, this is where they distribute themselves in the body. So isn't it fascinating how the same area of the body, even though ancient Chinese didn't really understand because they couldn't see it, here you can actually see the importance of the abdomen and immune areas and organs to, in fact, survival in life. So this is what we call integrative medicine, taking the knowledge and the core strengths and understanding of how we use these different treatments, not just integrative medicine for acupuncture, but think of aromatherapy. Think in this case of the way terpenes are now known to affect the user's sense, feeling about how cannabinoids and through the plant actually work. We're all integrated and connected, and I think people in traditional Chinese cultures perhaps have a better understanding of that. So where do the chemicals actually come from? It's a pretty bud, isn't that? When you see that and it's all frosted like that, it represents where the chemicals are. Now those chemicals, if you had a microscope and you could look up close, you'd start to see at the ends of all these little frostings are little structures called trichomes. They look like a golf ball on a tee. And those are really important because that's where not only the chemicals are made, but they're stored. If you remove just those trichomes and concentrate them, you get hashish. So when plants are known to develop lots of trichomes, it means they have a lot of potentially cannabinoids and terpenes, which both come from this area. But the thing that's most remarkable about these trichomes is that now when we test different samples, compared to when I was a kid growing up in South Florida, when the average concentration of THC in a plant might have been 4%, now we're pushing the envelope as 2018 approaches at 25%, perhaps more or less. The testing can produce some differences in terms of that final number, but this is an incredible feat of horticultural engineering and plant science for cultivation purposes, which in a sense may have unbalanced the plant. Just because something has more and is stronger or creates a more stony effect doesn't necessarily mean it's more therapeutic. And in fact, that's what I like about this event. The Emerald Cup, in my opinion, is different than, say, the Cannabis Cup. Cannabis Cup tends to award year after year higher and higher THC, usually more and more myrcene, which is the one terpene that's perhaps most responsible for a hypnotic, detached stoner phase. While the Emerald Cup started in California's Emerald Triangle, working with it largely as a medicine. In these last 25 years or so, again, once the discovery of the mechanism was found to work through the receptor system, the Emerald Cup's recognition of the balances that needed to be reestablished of cannabinoids and terpenes was critical. So if we did look at where the plant is today, and this is your doctor's warning for understanding while there's nothing wrong with euphoria, if you have one substantial fact about substance use to know that if you can't control your dose can control you. And so in 1978, it may have had a comical side to it, but imagine a size of that joint there if it was with today's stuff. So what does the plant look like and how have we actually changed it? Well, here's what the plant actually looks like. If you went to ancient fields, they're 20-foot plants. Typical, what they call phenotype, the shape. Not the chemotype, which represents the chemicals in it, or the genotype, which is the genetics. These are all different things. It's in fact the genotype that actually determines truly the root parents of the plant. The same way you can take a cheek swab in you and find out where your ancestors came from, when you know what the plant's genetics are, you can sort of map out maybe what part of the world it came from or what other things it might be mixed with. And that's an important tool. So the future is very much about genetics. The genetics of the natural plant are 20 feet tall. And guess what? It's easy to see a 20-foot plant with a helicopter. So what happened? In the earliest 1970s, this is Harvard professor Richard Evans Schultes, an ethnobotanist, with Afghani Kush number 1. Why is that an important point? Because this plant was 4 feet high. This plant had lots of THC, very free flowering, and carried along with it the baggage of that extra myrcene I was telling you about as the terpene creating the stoned effect. It's hard to find plants today that don't have the dominant genetics of this plant in them, and because it's 4 feet tall, it could be grown indoors. This is the source for that, as well as another plant, skunk number 1, that I'm going to show you in just a minute, no longer reflect ancient fields, which we call landrace. These were the fields that existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years across the globe, but where the likely combinations of the two principal cannabinoids, THC and the other cannabidiol, CBD, were very often found in approximately equal amounts. And it's not a surprise that the only accepted plant-derived drug that's out there now called Sativex from GW Pharma has in it approximate equal amounts of THC and CBD. It's specifically used for adults with muscle spasms for multiple sclerosis, but it follows this same formulary that likely indicates that that was what worked favorably with our genes for thousands of years compared to the way the plant's been changed today. So how has the plant really then changed? And this is a slide that I wanted to give some credit to Rob Clark, who's here, and yet I've advanced it to try to point out some things about the evolution of the plant from before 1970, when it did have a balance between THC and CBD that gave a natural protection. CBD tends to offset many of those ill-advised effects from THC. If a person has paranoia with THC, adding CBD back into it can very often alleviate it, because CBD by itself is a fantastic anxiety reliever. So the balance of chemicals largely has changed from that 1-to-1 amount to after 1970, now to reflect those changes that happened from the plant I showed you in the previous picture, Afghani Kush number 1, which has much more THC than CBD. So why is that important? Well, the plant's dominant traits, as I said, from the one that's hard to find plants today that don't have the genetics in it from that plant, created short, largely more indica-influenced hybrids with lots of THC and lots of that myrcene. And so the plant's changed from that 4 to 5% amount to THC, which does have the side effects, as intoxicating as there are, and to also recognize that there's nothing wrong with euphoria. But a plant that's out of balance does have something wrong with it. And in fact, the THC has been pushed partly because of these constraints of prohibition in just that direction compared to CBD. And CBD has more recently, from the good work from people at Project CBD and from the understanding now that derives from, for instance, Sanjay Gupta when he talked about how it's helped kids with seizures, you have some plants now that are pushing CBD while there's no side effects. In essence, that plant is almost equally guilty of being unidimensional. It no longer has the natural balance that those landrace heirloom plants, in a sense, had. And so, in fact, then, what's happened over these last 40 years or so is that the plant today is sort of unbalanced. Remember, we talked about the importance of balances in nature, not just in terms of how the endocannabinoid system keeps us in balance, but the plant evolved or co-evolved with human beings. We were the ones that dragged it around the world with us. So in essence, while we've been evolving, the plant may be, in a sense, devolving to be something that it naturally is not intended to be. So that brings us up to perhaps a pretty interesting quote, especially for this audience. I show this to doctors, they go, well, I don't know about that, because they're looking at other plants that extract specific singular chemicals. But Deepak Chopra actually has this quote about isolating an active constituent from a plant is an affront to nature. It's like taking the intelligence and leaving the wisdom behind. So where does that leave us today as a doc trying to take care of patients? Well, I'll tell you what, we get turned around sometimes. And industry is doing what industry does. It wants to sell product. It wants to create things that enhance and engage their customers as users, when in fact, in many respects, that cart's gotten ahead of the horse, which is really the science and reason that needs to support how we approach this as a medicine. So again, science and reason matter, and when you look at the way we've advanced through the different political legislative process, I wanted to point out, and maps are really valuable here, that the effects of the laws that came into existence a year ago November didn't only involve California here, it also involved Florida. Florida became full medical last year. But in a sense, everybody's been focused on California because unlike the other states, California's, what do you call it, the 6th largest economy, and how it started coming out of Prohibition from here 20, 25 years ago. Well, the states before California that had legal cannabis for adult use, we use that as the euphemism instead of recreational. God forbid children should get it. There are side effects there. But those would be the remaining 4 states in orange that don't have the star. The starred states got recreational as of last November, a year ago. But the states without the stars in orange, if you look at them, include Alaska, Colorado, Washington State, and Oregon. Well, you know what? Those are arguably the most isolated states for their borders of any of the 50 United States. Think about it. And if the intent of prohibition includes containing the drug, then the federal government really may have not had as much to be concerned about, because the drug doesn't seem to find its way over borders where there aren't people right on the other side. As a matter of fact, Kansas and Nebraska are suing Colorado, but that's still not because of a lot of breaches. When you look at last November, now you have California, Nevada, Maine, and Massachusetts who now have recreational use. Well, guess what? California's borders are isolated, and so are Nevada's and Maine's. Massachusetts matters in this, because even Jeff Sessions and our DEA can't possibly put an agent on every road leaving Massachusetts. And so in this sense, the genie's out of the bottle, and it's awfully hard to push back. So New England, in fact, may progress in a different way that ultimately has to have the federal government deal with this. That's just in the movement of who gets it. I'm still more interested in seeing if the federal government will acquiesce and at least advance this to Schedule 2. So myself as a doc who has a bona fide relationship with my patient, if they need it, I can actually legally prescribe it. Then I'll collect the data. Then I'll be involved with the outcome. Right now, most physicians do not care to see patients who want legal cannabis, even in states where it's legal. Why is that? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. All doctors have not that one state license, but they have a second license. It's called our DEA license. That's a federal license. And it's our ability, or it gives us the privilege, of prescribing medicines, from controlled substance, antibiotics, everything is dependent on our having a valid DEA license. So it's my tool bag. Most docs would not consider seeing a patient who wants cannabis out of a risk of potentially losing that federal DEA license. So in that sense, that's one of the reasons you don't see mainstream docs on board. But there's another reason, and this is important. Physicians are well trained, they're licensed, they go to school to learn a lot. You entrust your faith and confidence in us to take care of you as a healer. When you have states that pass legislation that determines which cannabinoids you can use and specifically for what diseases, last time I looked, that was called the practice of medicine. And physicians will push back hard when legislated the practice of what they know to do by non-licensed and non-trained legislators. So that's an important distinction there, and I want to try to share with you just a moment now the right thing to do. I'm honored at the University of Miami, where I come from, having been the immediate past president of our alumni association, to confer the oath of medicine to 200 new doctors coming out of our program each year. and it's an honor. But that Hippocratic oath, Hippocrates said certain things about plants a few thousand years ago. Well, not a few, but around 1,000. And that, too, nature itself is the best physician. And so acknowledging that, I wanted to try to impart upon you and the students I speak with, what's the right thing to do? Because a physician ultimately has to answer the question, should a physician offer compassionate access to cannabis while under its federal prohibition? And it's an interesting topic that needs a smart answer. And most people approach a situation like this by thinking of medical legal ethics. Now, why is that an important consideration? Well, because it's doctors and lawyers, it's against the federal law, but it has a medical benefit. I looked at what the American Medical Association says in its area of principle of medical ethics. And it says that a physician shall respect the law and also recognize a responsibility to seek changes in those requirements which are contrary to the best interests of the patient. Well, guess what? Sounds good. But when you've got that federal license at risk, as good as that is, you don't see many physicians truly advocating for the best interest of a patient. If you think that organized medicine, even the AMA, is there for patient advocacy, you might be surprised to know not really. It's a physician advocacy organization. And even states' departments of health, which you think would be patient advocates, are usually there to determine the rules and regulations that support the law, not to create the law itself. You do that as voters. So there needs to be a different way that this can be thought of, because if you think about it, medical legal ethics has failed in some areas to promote change or advances. So sometimes it takes a different approach to ethics that is called bioethics. Bioethics is a very powerful way of thought. It derived largely after World War II, when a lot of new science discoveries forced us into finding answers to questions we never knew to ask before. And so there had to be a somewhat different thought process compared to medical legal, just doctors and lawyers, and a bioethical process involves the whole community, the patients, clergy, lawmakers, people involved in healthcare, of course, and the legal profession. It involves everybody. So think about, if you would, about what happened with stem cells. Everybody's heard of stem cells and all those wonderful advances. Well, not much longer than about 10 years ago, there were very tight constraints. I think it was left over from George Bush #1's constraints on which cell lines could be used for stem cell research. Everybody was afraid, well, we're going to create the Frankenstein if we allow this to happen. Not so. And in fact, responsible researchers now have saved hundreds, if not thousands, of lives with advances through stem cells that had to find a solution through that same bioethical process. Cannabis needs that. And the reason it does is because it's not just medical legal, it's not just doctors and lawyers. It'll take this kind of input. And so when you look for a position statement, not unlike the one I showed you a moment ago for medical legal ethics from the AMA, you generally approach finding the answer to that question on top through one of two ways. You can do it by compromises, so you take the two sides and find some common middle ground to where nobody likes it, but they can both agree on a compromise. That hasn't worked well here. Hasn't worked well in certain other issues either. Think right to life. So there's a different approach to approaching a bioethical dilemma, and that's to try to come up with an irrefutable statement which neither side can deny. And that's what we've done here. I taught this, and it was included in the mandated physician education that every doctor in Florida has had to have taken in the course I wrote, published about 3 years ago by our Department of Health. And in fact, here is a line of thought that the first sentence talks about the disposition that a patient should have regarding their access to cannabis, and the second would be the disposition from the healer or the doctor. And so what I wrote is that seeking relief from the physical, psychological, or spiritual symptoms of disease is an instinctual force of human nature and may contribute to medicinal use. This is the way we're hardwired. Animals will self-soothe. People will do what they need to do when confronted with an intolerable symptom. pain can be not simply physical. And this is the reason we include it in psychological or even spiritual, if you're of that understanding, because this is the way we respond to a stress. So we regarded that first statement as being irrefutable because it just takes into account the way we are as living being animals. But in a humane way, then, the second sentence is where I tried to tie in what we do as healers by saying that the treatment of intolerable symptoms is an honorable task that a society bestows upon its healers to provide humane relief. So I view those as two complementary sentences, irrefutable, and it sort of says, get out of the way, please. Just let doctors take care of patients. We have bona fide relationships. We'd like to think we're well trained, but this affects research. It affects education. I have a problem when patients come with intelligent answers and doctors don't have an intelligent response, even if it's a response to say, I don't know. Because there's a lot that's not known about this. And that's kind of critical in the thought process. So things then that can unfetter research and allow education of doctors to proceed are going to take a federal initiative. So my one word of caution about California and here what's going on, be careful, because you're not in a vacuum here. You're still part of a larger federal structure. For some of you, it brings wonderful things. For others, it's made life miserable these last 20 or 30 years, hasn't it? But in that respect, we're all part of a bigger community, and I do feel it's going to take this, in fact, to have a change in the federal laws affecting prohibition. And it's taken now, since the early 90s, when California first started this trend, 25 or so years. You know what? California started the trend into prohibition. Are you aware of that California was the first state to prohibit cannabis? Around 1910, 11? You know why? It was because California was the first state that was really, if you think about it, exposed to a terrorist attack. What do I mean? This was shortly after Pancho Villa comes up from Mexico, not representing Mexican government, but a vigilante group taking over U.S. land and killing Americans. That's the definition of it, isn't it? So guess what they brought along with them from Mexico? Marijuana. That's the first time the word was used like that. Before, it's always the Latin, cannabis. So it took from 1910 or 11 till 1937, 27 years, before cannabis became prohibited throughout the United States. Isn't it interesting now that we're reaching this pivotal point threshold of the number of Americans, the number of states that might affect a change on the federal level, that it's about that same time frame, again, starting from California and working its way east. So with that understanding and with that due caution, I want to sort of share with you a closing thought because of the way we started this, talking critically but giving you insight into how the plant works, how it's changed, why its changes may not be as good as you might think, and so why I applaud the people who, from this part of California, are involved with the cultivation of potentially new medicines showing new effects and uses, and perhaps safety profiles as they get rid of some of those excesses of cannabinoids, THC, and particularly terpenes like myrcene. As others are being understood and the balances are being redone, it's important that we sort of think about how this is approached from a temptation indulgence perspective. That's the way most of you or those in a recreational state are sort of approaching it. But it's important to know about the risks and the rewards. Because if you can see the imagery in the smoke there, it looks seductive and it looks a little spooky, but it can change. And in fact, we're right now at a pivotal point that you have to be concerned and provide due caution to be careful what we wish for. And that's because ultimately science and reason really do matter.